and also Will Humble from Arizona. He was the former state health officer there who implemented their entire medical marijuana program. Dr. Knox is an MD physician who does a lot of physician education about the endocannabinoid system, how medical marijuana works within the body, and all kind of just physician education. So we are so excited to have them both here, and we're thankful for their time. They are not paid to be here. They are volunteering their time to be here because they believe in a well-established medical marijuana program that they both have in their states, and they want that for Mississippi and want to be a resource. So we're going to go and kick it off with that, and Dr. Knox is going to go through a presentation. Then Will Humble is going to go through a short presentation, and then we'll open it up for Q&A after that.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here because this is an important subject globally right now, and we're still in the forefront. So this presentation will be as brief as I can make it, titled Mitigating Risk and Optimizing Experience, Why Medical Marijuana Programs Matter and Make a Difference. So first, very briefly, my background. I'm one of 4 medical doctors hailing from conventional medicine. I myself trained in family and integrative medicine. My sister on the far right, Dr. Jessica, comes from public health. My mom, Dr. Janice Knox, is an anesthesiologist for 32 years in practice. And my dad in the middle, just retired from 40 years in the emergency department. We founded the American Cannabinoid Clinics, where we practice something called integrative and functional cannabinoid medicine, and Advent Academy, and that's our academy where we train other health professionals in the physiology of the endocannabinoid system and cannabis medicine. And we've been operating in regulated medical cannabis programs since 2011. Across the 4 of us, we carry many medical licenses in the United States, but primarily operate in California, Oregon, and Washington. My personal additional experience, one of the reasons why I'm here today, is that I chair the Oregon Cannabis Commission. This commission was a governor's appointed commission to address our medical program and improve our medical program, ensuring that we're developing long-term strategies for research in our state around cannabis, as well as ensuring that cannabis remains an affordable and viable option for our most vulnerable populations. Towards the bottom, I'm the founder of the Oregon Cannabis Clinicians Group, and this was very important in Oregon, where medical doctors and nurses and all of our healthcare professionals are impacted by the use of cannabis. So this was our attempt to create an interdisciplinary voice to advocate for ourselves and for our patients. And lastly, I'm here because I was deployed here to talk to you, and I'm very proud to do so on behalf of Doctors for Cannabis Regulation. And we promote an evidence-based approach to preventing recreational use amongst our teens, as well as avoiding misuse with our adult population. So I always have to cover at least a brief history of cannabis because legalization has to be considered in context. So we have the earliest recorded use of cannabis as medicine from 2737 BC out of China, listing cannabis in their pharmacopoeia, which is a text detailing the common agricultural and medicinal plants at the time. In India, there are Ayurvedic texts that considered cannabis one of 5 most sacred plants. If we fast forward to 1850, this is when cannabis was actually added to the American Pharmacopoeia. Cannabis made up 50% of patented prescription drugs that doctors prescribed. Eli Lilly, Merck, the Pfizers of today were formulating cannabis preparations for doctors to use. It was one of 3 most commonly used medicines, along with alcohol and aspirin. If we get into the 1930s and 1940s, the Marijuana Tax Act was the first blow that pushed cannabis out of favor. Now, as you can see, I keep on using the term cannabis. Marijuana was not introduced into our lexicon until Mexican immigrants came to the United States smoking something called marijuana. In juxtaposition to that, a lot of black jazz musicians would smoke reefer. Doctors only knew this plant as cannabis. We did not understand it as marijuana. But when doctors realized that the Marijuana Tax Act was to be imposed on them, which put an onerous tax on anybody who touched the plant, from cultivation to processing, so those pharmaceutical companies, to prescription, to possession, became things that were required to first procure a tax act in order to do. So playing on the racist sentiments of the era, right? The federal government, along with our industrialists, the Carnegies and Mellons, who had a lot of investments in textiles, in paper milling, in petrochemicals, the industries that the hemp plant could disrupt went after this plant. So with this Marijuana Tax Act, doctors were prescribing cannabis without procuring it, unfortunately began to be prosecuted very heavily. The American Medical Association in 1937 actually testified before Congress, telling them we did not know that marijuana was our medicine, and we strongly encourage you to start testing it, start studying it. But this was ignored by Congress at the time. Into the 1960s and 70s we go. Little known fact is that the federal government funded Israeli researchers to the tune of $100,000 annually to study the cannabis plant. In 1963 and 64, an organic chemist by the name of Dr. Raphael Mechoulam isolated and described the chemical structure of THC and CBD, the most abundant phytocannabinoids found in the cannabis plant. In 1970, we saw Nixon placed cannabis as a Schedule I drug in the Controlled Substances Act, declaring that cannabis had no medicinal value, had high potential for abuse and addiction. In the 1980s and 90s, however, the FDA approved Marinol and had in 1975 federally approved another THC derivative called Sesamet. Sesamet and Marinol were synthetic THC derivatives that were FDA approved to treat chronic nausea and vomiting as a side effect of chemotherapy, as well as wasting syndrome or anorexia due to HIV and AIDS. Now, when these synthetic THC molecules were FDA approved, we actually did not know how they worked in the body. It wasn't until 1988, again 3 years after Marinol was approved and 13 years after Sesamet was approved, that researchers wondered how THC worked in the body. So what they did is radio tag the THC molecule, put it in a human being, and watched what it did. And what it did was light up an extensive receptor network system, a neuromodulating system in our bodies, well throughout the brain and the rest of the body. They called this receptor system the CB1 receptor system. And between 1988 and 1995, they went on to discover another cannabinoid receptor, CB2. They uncovered the two most well-studied ligands or keys that fit into those receptors like LOCK to unlock downstream effects, anandamide and 2-AG, as well as the enzymes that made these ligands and broke them down when they were needed. This was the discovery of the endocannabinoid system. And now, well into the 2000s, we understand that this system is the regulatory system of all physiological systems. There is not a bodily function that occurs without the input and direction of the endocannabinoid system. From conception until death, this system is working to keep us in balance. So decades of research have revealed this integral system in our bodies that keep us healthy, that keep us well, that keep us in balance. But every single day it's evolving more and more and more. We are now calling it the endocannabinoid dome. And this network functions, this is a beautiful picture, sort of complicated, but it's just to demonstrate the complexity of this system. It operates like a retrograde signaling system to keep our body, again, in balance. And we like to say it keeps us relaxed, it helps us eat, it helps us sleep, it helps us forget, and it also protects us. A good example that I like to use to demonstrate how this works is if we were all to imagine ourselves living in a dormitory, right, or an apartment building, and our neighbor across the hall is playing really, really loud music. It's starting to disrupt our quality of life. Well, what do? We call them, or we walk over to them and let them know their music is too loud, and they turn it off. So in this way, if we're overstimulated because of pain or stress or fatigue or inflammation, what the system is supposed to do is to correct those systems. Now I want to touch briefly on our endocannabinoids. So our body, like I mentioned, makes its own cannabinoids. So we've understood that THC and CBD are cannabinoids found in cannabis. Well, they are cannabinoids that our body makes all on their own. The two best studied are anandamide and 2-AG. And when our endocannabinoid system is dysfunctional, we actually see our most chronic diseases. So here I've demonstrated some of our endocannabinoid system excessive. So if you were to have a hyperactive endocannabinoid system, we see diseases of obesity, diabetes, rheumatic disease, cancer, or epilepsy. And when you're dealing with endocannabinoid system deficiency, we're seeing the diseases of migraine, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, PTSD, and also epilepsy. Again, this system keeps our bodies finely tuned. And so if there is an area in our body that's expressing excess endocannabinoid system function or deficient endocannabinoid system dysfunction, we can wind up with a variety of chronic disease processes. And these are the top contributors to our endocannabinoid system dysfunction. They should look very familiar to you all. Emotional stress, chemical insult, poor diets, the standard American diet would be an example of that, chronic prescription drug use, and how all of these things interplay on our genetics, as well as the natural effects of aging. I bring these up next, the major phytocannabinoids, THC and CBD, because they are analogous to the cannabinoids our bodies make in themselves. Here, THC is listed as analogous to anandamide. That means it behaves similarly to anandamide. So if I go back a couple slides, and we're looking at diseases of endocannabinoid deficiency, and I can take PTSD as an example. PTSD is a classic deficiency in anandamide. We're deficient in anandamide. So similar to being deficient in vitamin D, what do we do when we're low in vitamin D? We take vitamin D supplementation. So THC happens to be an effective therapy for folks suffering from PTSD because that THC is mimicking the anandamide that they're deficient in. Cannabis is also full of chemicals called terpenes. Terpenes are the aromatic compounds that give all botanicals, fruits, flowers, vegetables, or trees, their scent. Think of essential oils. They are chock full of these things, terpenes. These are pharmacologically active molecules. That's why people diffuse lavender, for example, to feel calm. They might diffuse a citrus oil, an orange, or a grapefruit to uplift their mood. Well, these terpenes also exist in the cannabis plant. So in general, this cannabis plant represents a treasure trove of phytochemicals that work on the endocannabinoid system, the system in our body that restores itself into balance. And so these are some new terms that I love to introduce to folks because we are pioneering a new era of medicine. Cannabinology is the study of cannabinoids and cannabis and their pharmacology. Endocannabinology, which is what I practice, is the study of the function and dysfunction of the endocannabinoid system and how to modulate that system to correct disease. And then the last thing here listed is functional integrative endocannabinology, which is the practice that I get to practice with my patients in Oregon. That's my little ECS guy. All right, so in our clinic, the most common presenting conditions are common everywhere. We see a lot of cancer and associated comorbidities. We see epilepsy and associated comorbidities. This is a big one in our pediatric population that's also suffering from things like autism and ADHD. We have chronic pain. That is the #1 reason globally that patients are seeking cannabis as medicine. And of course, we also have PTSD and its comorbidities. And I have 2 examples of patients that we care for in our clinics. The first is Baby D. Baby D came to us at 3 months old. He had an astrocytoma, which is a form of brain cancer. He had frequent seizures and inability to track and wasn't meeting other milestones that he should have been meeting. He was failing chemotherapy. The doctors, his oncologist team at OHSU actually told the parents there was nothing else that could be done for this kid. The best they could do was keep him on chemotherapy to prevent a rapid increase in growth of the tumor, but that was it. And a nurse that was overseeing this kid's care is an advocate for medical cannabis and suggested to the patients that they come to see us so they could learn about cannabis as an alternative or adjunctive in addition to treatment option to the chemotherapy for that baby. So that baby came in and we recommend that the parents start him on a fully extracted cannabis oil. It's a whole plant extract. And with use, we saw after 3 months a reduction of that tumor by 25%, and at 6 months a reduction in 50%. This also was accompanied by a reduction in seizures, an improvement in tracking, and now 2 years later this baby has met his milestones. Another example of a patient is Mrs. W. Now she's coming in with fibromyalgia, which is a form of chronic pain. She was expressing that her prescription drugs, opiates and NSAIDs, were giving her unwanted and toxic side effects, and she had heard cannabis might work with her. Well, with use of a combination, we call it method layering of various cannabis products, she chose tinctures and vaping, she was able to get off all of her prescription drugs. And this was a woman who was so debilitated by her chronic pain that she couldn't get up and enjoy walking or running. And now she's running marathons again. So the message here is that controlled clinical oversight means improved patient access to safe, professional, directed, and documented care. We're documenting these stories and these data points that we're receiving from the patients that we work with. So what forms of cannabis are medicine? This is very important to all people everywhere. And I'm here to declare that all forms of cannabis preparations are important. It's about appropriate use based on clinical need, as well as the bioavailability. There are certain conditions that actually require certain types of administration methods. So here I have listed the most common methods of use in the marketplace. We have our pulmonaries, which include smoking and vaping. We have our GI, or our ingestibles, which would include edibles or capsules or drinkables. We have our transmucosals, and these are preparations like tinctures or oils that you can rub in the nasal septum or into the gums or drop under the tongue. We have suppositories that can be applied rectally or vaginally, and we have our topicals or transdermals. And depending on what condition we're trying to treat, we might make a variety of recommendations, and typically we're recommending more than one. I think a great example of a reason why we might method layer would be chronic pain. Chronic pain is by and large an inflammatory condition, and to drive down inflammation systemically as a whole, we recommend ingesting in one form or another. For acute pain though, we want to get fast relief, so it's very common for us to approve and recommend inhaling. A lot of folks are afraid of inhaling cannabis, but we have clinical trials that demonstrate that even smoking cannabis from a joint decreases the risk of lung cancer. It does not increase the risk of lung cancer. The drive home point here is that appropriate consumption methods should be determined between the doctor and the patient and according to clinical needs. And lastly, regulated medical cannabis programs do mitigate public health risk. The reality is that 1 in 2 Americans are sick with something. Here I have demonstrated that 1 in 10 people have heart disease and or cancer. 1 in 5 people have chronic pain of some sort, mental illness or IBS, it's inflammatory, irritable bowel syndrome, 1 in 3 people suffer from insomnia, high blood pressure, or pre-diabetes. 1 in 2 people suffer from chronic headaches. And I have an asterisk here by diabetes because by the year 2050, we are expecting to see 1 in 2 people with full-blown diabetes, and 1 in 1.5 people are suffering from some form of chronic stress. And all these people, because the consumer is growing more and more intelligent by the day with the University of Google, are turning to cannabis as their solution. Whether it's CBD or medical marijuana, people are curious, they're finding this product, and they're using it. But unfortunately, our market is currently flooded with a bunch of stuff. CBD is everywhere right now with the passing of the Farm Bill. What are in these products? We don't know. In the unregulated space, and it has been tested, we're seeing 1/3 of products containing no CBD but marketed as CBD products. We're seeing 1/3 containing THC marketed as CBD products. And then we're seeing about the other 1/3 that are representing accurately the contents of their products. The point is, an unregulated marketplace makes for uncertain medical products. So a regulated market is a safer market. So on the right I have a regulated marketplace which is a surrogate for safe access. In a regulated marketplace, we can track from soil to sale, right? We know where these products came from. We've established processing practices. So when a person is procuring a product from a treatment center or dispensary, they can be confident that a regulated system has approved this product. In a regulated market, we can safety test for quality control. In a regulated market, we know what chemical profiles, what cannabinoids are present, what terpenes are present, as well as other solvents and other ingredients that might be added. In a regulated market, we have clinical oversight, right? Patients have to come in and talk to a doctor and have intelligent conversations with those doctors before they're able to use these products. We see a decreased risk of misuse or abuse. In our clinics, patients tell us they don't want to get high. So we work together to use products to minimize the unwanted effects of THC. And in a regulated market, we have the opportunity to collect data, right? We can track outcomes and we can measure in a controlled setting public health effects. Juxtaposed to this is the unregulated market. This is unsafe access. Like I said, people are accessing it somehow anyways. With unknown sources, unknown quality, unknown chemical profiles, solvents, and other ingredients. We're all concerned about the vaping crisis. Well, the overwhelming majority of these vaping devices are unregulated. We don't know what they're laced with, okay? And lastly, we see an increased risk of misuse or abuse. Without education about how to use cannabis products more effectively and appropriately, we're seeing people misuse it. Most of the times unintentionally, okay? So in summary, when informed by science, optimized for safety, and clinically managed, a regulated medical cannabis program is good policy. And that concludes my portion of the presentation.
Can you go back to that last slide?
Yeah.
Good visual, thank you. Thank you so much. That was so good from a medical perspective, and this is a really good segue into talking about it more so from the regulatory perspective. And as I mentioned, Will Humble was the health officer in Arizona responsible for implementing their entire medical marijuana program, which is working so wonderfully. I'm going to step out. I don't know if anybody knew. They had a kitchen fire. I know some of you knew they had a kitchen fire the other night, so they're doing work. I'm just going to go make sure they know that we're in your meeting, but you can go ahead and get started.
Just the arrows?
You just do, yeah.
Okay. So thanks for the invitation. Again, my name is Will Humble. I was the director for the Arizona Department of Health Services from 2009 to 2015. And during that time, voters in Arizona approved the Arizona Medical Marijuana Act. That was in November of 2010. And so I was leading and responsible for the agency at the time when we implemented the program. And so when they invited me to come out here today, I agreed because I believe in the program and I think we did a good job, and I think I can provide some perspective and maybe answer some questions that you have. And by the way, I was, some of you probably know Mary Courier, who was the health director. We overlapped, and so I knew her through a health officer association that we participated in. And then after this, I think we'll have some Q&A. You can ask some questions and so forth. So the Arizona program was approved in November of 2010, like I said. It's a little bit different from the Mississippi statutory language in many ways, and actually just a few ways, and I'll go over what some of those things are. Some of the bullets that I'll cover here are similarities with Mississippi, but I think I'll skip the Arizona specifically because you're probably more interested in what do I think about the Mississippi language and with respect to how we implemented things in Arizona. So here are let me go over some of the strengths of the Arizona program, and then I'll go over some of the things with Mississippi. The big picture is that patients who needed medical marijuana after we implemented the program were able to get it. Our medical marijuana program, the way we built the system, all the cards are fully electronic, so there's no lines lining up at vital records and so forth. And so when a patient sees a physician who signs a certification, they upload that information online. And we had a little bit of resistance to that at the beginning because people thought, well, what about those people that can't have access to computers and that sort of stuff? Pretty much everybody has been able to figure it out with a younger daughter, a family member, or somebody who can help upload the information. And actually, a lot of doctors will upload that information for the patients, and that's something I would recommend for the Mississippi program as well. But that's up to the state health department, if this passes. In Arizona, we've got a lot of different combinations of THC and CBD throughout the dispensaries. In your language, it's called treatment centers. Arizona, we call them dispensaries, but it's essentially the same thing. In our program, we developed what are called dispensary agents and dispensary medical directors. And that's something that I think has been successful in Arizona, that if it passes here in Mississippi, I would recommend that the State Health Department include those pieces, because the dispensary agents have some background and training that's required so that as they're talking with patients, we've already talked about the patient interacting on the certification, but when they go into the dispensary, the agents are the folks that are there that can be knowledgeable and help them with the different combinations of CBD and THC and other products, both flower and edibles. And I agree that it's important to have a combination of both the flower, which is what you think of the smokable marijuana, and the edibles, because it's different for different patients. And I think one of the strengths also with having smokable cannabis be available in the program is because it's a lot easier to self-regulate if it does have THC in the product, versus an edible, which is less easily to regulate, because it might, if you take an edible, it might take half an hour, 45 minutes, and even an hour to feel that therapeutic effect and the effect of the THC. So smokable marijuana, I think, is an important component. And so I've said that publicly, both in my job and now subsequent to that. In Arizona, compliance has been good, generally. But again, having good compliance is dependent on having the health department build responsible regulations, and then having the health department have the kinds of resources that they need to build and regulate the program. And one of the things that I like about the Mississippi statutory language is that those revenues are built into the program, both through the patient cards, but also through the sales taxes that are provided within the Mississippi language. And Arizona's program has been self-funding. I have to admit, one of the big mistakes I made in this program is I set the price of the cards too high, because we charge $150 for medical marijuana cards in Arizona, and that's created way too much revenue. And so I copped that. We should have charged much lower. The Mississippi language has it at a maximum of $50, which I think is a better price. We set the price too high, and now we have too much money. One of the things that happens in Arizona, there's $90 million in the fund, but the state legislature can't sweep it, or they would have. So it's sitting in a fund gathering interest and being invested. One of the challenges that we had in Arizona and continue to have that Mississippi won't have, and I just want to be transparent about this, is that in the Arizona language that the voters approved, they listed naturopathic physicians as physicians that can certify for medical marijuana. And what happened in Arizona is that about 90% of the certifications in Arizona, has 200,000 certifications, came from the naturopathic physician group. And it wasn't naturopaths as a whole that were signing large numbers of certifications. It's really a subset of about 20 naturopaths that have signed large numbers of certification. I just wanted to be transparent about that being a problem, but it's also something that I wanted to highlight that will not be a problem in the Mississippi program. And another thing that I just feel compelled to say is that medical doctors and DOs in Arizona also sign certifications, but when I was the director for those 6 years, we didn't have any compliance problems or any unprofessional conduct with MDs and DOs. And so I think that's another strength of the Mississippi statutory language. And from what I understand, you don't even have licensed naturopaths in the state. But I think it's a good idea to have this rest with DOs and MDs. And like I said, our experience in Arizona has been very good, and virtually no unprofessional conduct in terms of signing too many certifications or signing certifications without a real medical visit, etc. Another area which has been a challenge in Arizona that is not, I don't think, going to be a problem in Mississippi, is that Arizona's statutory language built a whole bunch of confidentiality pieces that were unnecessary. In other words, in Arizona, if a dispensary is not complying with the state regulations, that information is not discoverable by you as journalists. And so you might do a records request to the Arizona Department of Health, and they ask for the dispensary compliance records, and they're not going to give you anything back. It's not because they're being belligerent, it's because they can't. It was built into the Arizona language. One of the things I like about the Mississippi statutory language is there is a lot of sunshine in that legislative language. In other words, there's not the kinds of unnecessary restrictions on public information that is in the Arizona law, and I think that's a strength of the Mississippi language as well. I just want to touch briefly on some of the comparisons of the Mississippi and Arizona law. These are some of the similarities. Physicians, certified patients that can benefit based on defined medical conditions. That's the same in both Arizona and Mississippi. In Mississippi, and I like your language better again, it's limited to medical doctors and MDs and DOs. Arizona includes homeopaths and naturopaths, and that's where I said we had some of the problems with some of the naturopathic physicians. Again, a subset of them. And I'll talk a little bit in a couple of slides about interventions that are important as, in case this passes, in the event that this passes, that the Department of Health work with the licensing boards for the feedback loop on that. Very similar in terms of the statutory language, and I think both of these are reasonable. Arizona and Mississippi both have 2.5 ounces every 2 weeks. I think that's a reasonable amount. It's been working well in Arizona, both with edible components and flour. I won't get too much into the weeds. We had some people that believed people could buy 2.5 ounces of edibles every 2 weeks, which I always push back against, because that's a lot more than 2.5 ounces of flour. And so the way we interpret the regulations is that the limitation is 2.5 ounces of the marijuana, the cannabis product, and whatever that creates in terms of edibles is the equivalent of the 2.5 ounces. And the courts, people sued and people were arrested, and the courts have adjudicated this in Arizona, and that's the way it's been interpreted. In both cases, the state health department is responsible for making the program work. And so one of the ways I like to explain the difference between statute and regulations is that the voters in Mississippi this November are going to be in the position of approving a statute. So that's the structural language of the program, that it'll be the responsibility of the Mississippi Health Department to put together the regulations to actually make that system work. And that's the same, that worked the same way both in Arizona and Mississippi. And in a couple of slides, I have some bullets of some of the most important components that I believe the Mississippi State Health Department should be looking at as they build the regulations. Because the voters approve the structure, but the health department is actually the entity that makes it work. And one of the things I like about the Mississippi statutory language is that it gives very broad authority to the state health department to create those regulations. A couple other things that are a little bit different between Arizona and Mississippi. Again, I'm starting to sound like an evangelist for the Mississippi language, and I do like it better. One of the reasons is, in Arizona, our statutory language limited the number of dispensaries to 140. The Mississippi statutory language doesn't define it that way. I think it's better to my personal opinion is it's better to have the marketplace decide how many dispensaries are viable, and let the marketplace decide how they meet the needs of patients. In Arizona, in a sense, I'm not going to call it exactly a cartel, but the licenses have had transferable value and investment value because they're limited in number. And I just think, me personally, I would have rather have this Mississippi language because it lets the market decide how many, you guys are calling them treatment centers, we call them dispensaries, but essentially it's the same thing. Local zoning is super important, and it was important in Arizona, and it's also very important in Mississippi because it's critical to have the buy-in from local jurisdictions in terms of where the treatment centers can be located. That's the Mississippi language. In Arizona, it's called dispensaries. And we worked up front with the local jurisdictions, the Association of Mayors and elected officials, and as long as the health department is working in conjunction with those local elected officials, they can come up with reasonable zoning. And by the way, another thing I like is we only had in Arizona 120 days to build our whole program, and this statutory language gives a lot more time, more than a year. So that's more time to be more diligent, and so another reason I like the statutory language in Mississippi better. Again, I mentioned the last bullet here is around transparency. I think, I've been in state government my whole career, and it's super important to have transparency built into public policy, because that transparency is what holds public institutions accountable. And when you remove that transparency, as what's happened in Arizona, you lose the ability for journalists like yourselves and other people who are interested in the efficiency of the program from finding out what's actually going on. And I'm really happy to see that in Mississippi you've got you don't have any restrictions on that. And so that is accountability in a public system, which is something I really like. I think I've already covered most of these things, but I thought it's kind of a good compilation slide to show the strengths in the various programs. I don't spend a lot more time because I know everybody's on a tight schedule. Another thing I haven't mentioned is that the Mississippi language has more robust enforcement options than we have in the Arizona language. And like I said, we did a good job, at least while I was in charge, at the health department holding dispensaries accountable to our regulations. What I like in the Mississippi language is there are more enforcement options, including civil money penalties, which I think is it's a good way of getting the attention of treatment centers that aren't in compliance before you move right to revocation and suspension. And so I think those are good in terms of public policy. That's built into the Mississippi regs. I'm not going to go through this slide. This is all publicly available, and you can show this. And this is actually I'm meeting with some other folks later on in the day, and I want to sort of highlight some of those things that are really important things for the health department to consider. I think I've mentioned all of these things. What I will do at the end is add that, you know, when we did our program back in 2010, there were just a handful of states that had medical marijuana programs at the time. And Colorado had some decent regulations around inventory control, cultivation, packaging, labeling, etc. But there weren't very many states to learn from back in 2010 when we were building our program. Mississippi's in a much better position, being 10 years later. There are a lot more states that have built their medical marijuana programs, and so there are a lot more case studies out there and a lot more regulations to work from. And what I used to say when I was in the state government is to my staff that, you know, a lot of my staff came from academia, and they, you know, we get in trouble for copying each other's paper. And plagiarism is a bad thing in academia, but in state government, plagiarism is a virtue, not a vice. If you're copying good regulations that work, that other states have tried, you can really avoid recreating the wheel and create a more efficient program more quickly. So I think all the pieces are in place to have an efficient program here in Mississippi. And if there were weaknesses in your statute, I would say so, because I would. But I think it's really well written. And by the way, I just wish Arizona had language like Mississippi did, because it's more open-ended and gives more flexibility to the state health department. So with that, I'm done.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, and then I don't know if I mentioned, so Connor Reeves is the campaign's medical policy advisor. He's the former general counsel for the Mississippi State Medical Association. He's now in private practice, but we have retained him as the campaign's medical policy advisor, and he's just a wonderful asset to the program. So he's also here with me and can answer questions about our initiative and Mississippi's medical marijuana program and the status of our campaign. At this point, we can go ahead and open it up for any questions that anyone has for Dr. Knox or Will Humble.
What was your name? You just spoke. What's your name again?
Will Humble.
Okay, Dr. Humble.
Oh, I'm not a doctor. Just
Over in
administrator.
Arizona, what is the ownership of the dispensaries? Is it limited to medical, say doctors and pharmacists, or is it more corporate? Who can get a license?
Yes.
What do you see over there?
So what happened in Arizona is that the voter-approved language set the cap at it's 10% of the number of pharmacies, which turned out to be 140. And so because the number of licenses was limited in that way, there was an intrinsic value in getting one of the limited number of licenses. And so, you know, so what we did back in 2011, which by the way, you're not going to have to do that in Mississippi because it's not a limited number. But what we did in Arizona is we opened up our application system for those dispensary licenses, and we got almost 500 applications for the 120 districts that we set throughout the state. And we actually had a random selection, a qualified random selection of those certificates and licenses in Arizona. And some people paid the application fee and were unsuccessful, and some people got the licenses. One of the provisions in the Arizona Medical Marijuana Act were that each, going to your question, that each dispensary was in the statutory language designed to be a nonprofit medical marijuana dispensary. But it wasn't in our statutory language, it wasn't, those entities weren't required to file with the IRS with nonprofit status and file 990s, nor were they required to register with the Arizona Corporation Commission as a nonprofit. Weakness is in our statute, again, that's not a problem in the Mississippi law. And to getting to the final part of your question, because of the limited number of licenses and the way that the operators were able to be creative about how they form operating agreements within those nonprofit dispensaries, some of the dispensaries have become quite valuable. And it's an artifact of having a limited number of dispensaries and having a marketplace that's driven by a cap that's defined in statute versus what I think is a better system, which is in the Mississippi law, which doesn't have that kind of cap.
What's the general criteria required for someone who gets a license over there? Overall criteria.
Well, there's an application.
The main ones.
The main one is to have you have to file a business plan that documents how you're going to operate your dispensary. You need to file annual reports that show your books. That turns into the state health department. There's an application fee, of course, and then all the applicants need to get a background check with the DPS, so there's fingerprint checks for all the applicants and dispensary agents as well.
What about requirements for medically trained personnel, say, like I said, pharmacists or others?
Within the dispensary, there's two pieces in the regulations that we've built. Each dispensary has a dispensary medical director, which is required to be a physician, and they also have dispensary agents, which have to go through a background check, including a fingerprint check. So those are things that we built into our regulations that Mississippi State Health Department could build into their regulations as well. And I would recommend that, especially the background check, but also the training for the dispensary agents, because that's that direct patient to dispensary interaction that happens within the dispensary, and it's important to have qualified folks, which we call dispensary agents, that are able to help patients. Does that answer your question?
We have a question over here.
The Mississippi Board of Health, several members of the board sent a letter out to newspapers, websites, etc., opposing the medical marijuana initiative. And I think their opposition, there were three main points. One was they disputed the evidence that there were legitimate studies proving medical efficacy for marijuana and a variety of illnesses. Number two, they pointed to the much stronger marijuana that's out now and that it can create mental illness and psychosis in young adults. And then number three, they said that the FDA has approved medicines which have either cannabis oil or THC in them that are legally used in Mississippi, and thus this kind of legalization is not necessary. So could you respond to those arguments?
Yeah. There are 21,000 and counting peer-reviewed research articles documenting the medical potential of cannabis, as well as cannabis's pharmacological interaction with the endocannabinoid system and other receptor systems. As I mentioned in my presentation, cannabis has been studied since the 1960s, funded by our own federal government. Now, during the 1970s, our federal government also prohibited our own American universities from studying the plant, although NIDA, the National Institute for Drug Abuse, was allowed to study cannabis, although only to determine its risks, so its negative impacts. And what's very interesting to me is that now in 2020, after I think 2 iterations of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine putting out meta-analyses of the cannabis research to date that has demonstrated and declares that cannabis has tremendous therapeutic potential and calls out specific conditions like chronic pain and epilepsy as diseases that are well treated by cannabis, that anybody is continuing to promote the rhetoric that cannabis has not been well studied. It has, right? Our National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine have written 2 reports now declaring that. Also, a lesser known fact is that the federal government, as represented by the Department of Health and Human Services, applied for a patent on cannabinoids as medicine in 1999, and it was awarded in 2003, and you can Google this. This patent says in plain language that cannabinoids are a treatment of inflammatory conditions, ischemic conditions, traumatic brain injury. It lists specifically by name Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, Alzheimer's disease. So it's no wonder that I think 3 cases have gone before the Supreme Court to defend cannabis as medicine, right? Because it's sort of hypocritical to have a federal agency owning a patent on cannabinoids as medicine while also maintaining its Schedule I status. Those are in direct contradiction to one another. So, you know, the cat's out the bag. We have plenty of preclinical and clinical trials demonstrating the therapeutic potential. We can no longer hide behind the veil of prohibition. Healthcare providers or regulators. And then that was the first part. The second part, I can answer all 3. What was the second part?
Well, let's.
The psychosis?
Let's go to that last. The
Okay.
second was that there were FDA-approved medicines that had cannabinoid oil
Yes.
and THC
So-
in them that are legal to prescribe in Mississippi, and thus all this
Yeah.
new law is not necessary.
So we have 2 FDA-approved synthetic THC drugs. That is a monomolecular drug, meaning just a THC derivative, no other chemicals. We have Epidiolex, which is a full plant extract, really the first of its kind, FDA-approved for use in the United States. It is essentially a CBD isolate. It's also cut with alcohol and other ingredients like sucralose. These prescription drugs are approved for very few conditions. So the side effects of chemotherapy, so nausea and vomiting, or wasting, or what we call anorexia, an absence of hunger in patients with wasting diseases. And then Epidiolex for only 3 very hard to treat retractable seizure types. Epidiolex will cost insurers $30,000 to $60,000 a year per patient. And if they're used off-label, even more, right? So these actually are not viable options for patients. Medical program expands the number of patients that have access to cannabis as medicine. The other issue with the FDA-approved drugs are that they're monomolecular. They come with increased risk of side effect, which means their therapeutic window is much more narrow. And with increasing doses, we're seeing many more side effects. So for even THC, which is our euphorogenic and intoxicating phytocannabinoid, when in isolation, it is way more potent and way more toxic. Patients typically do not tolerate Sesamet or Marinol, whereas they do much better tolerate cannabis, even at increasing THC potencies. The benefit of a regulated marketplace, however, can limit the potency of THC that's cultivated and processed. So here you would have the opportunity to put a cap on the amount of THC that can be contained in a product for sale. Right now with the legacy market, right, that unregulated black market, we have no idea how much THC is present. Not to mention other contaminants like heavy metals and molds and pesticides, etc. So I am trying to make the case that the regulated market is much safer than not having a market at all, when again the increasing intelligence of the consumer is taking them to the internet or out of state or to the corner to get their medicine.
And then finally, the psychosis and the increasing strength.
Yeah.
Um,
So what science and clinical evidence is showing us that there is an association in people who have a family member, first degree family member with a mental illness that includes psychosis, or people who have like what we call like a prodrome. So early signs and symptoms of eventually developing psychosis, we lower the threshold to presentation. So in a sense, what I'm trying to say is patients who are more likely to develop psychosis anyways without cannabis, the earlier they start using cannabis, specifically high THC potency products, the quicker we see the onset. So we actually do not have conclusive evidence that says that THC causes psychosis. It's in a very niche population, people who are already predisposed to developing it, that we might see an earlier onset. But also this is one of the reasons why a regulated market is better. Again, control for the amount of THC people can procure at any given time. And I can tell you with medical management oversight in a controlled setting, we are better equipped to help manage doses over a longer period of time. Again, medical patients come because they're seeking an alternative. The overwhelming majority of them, almost 100% of them, tell us we do not want to get high. And many of them also understand that they might have a condition that is best treated with THC. So it's all about time and place. It's all about what the science is demonstrating to us. Cannabis is not a cure-all, but what we can do is mitigate risks on one end of the spectrum and optimize a patient's experience on the other end. But we need all stakeholders to be involved to create a regulated system that makes the most sense for most people.
And the Mississippi Department of Health would have the authority to set the regulations to put a cap like you described. So the ability for the health department to make those regulations is in the voter approved language. It's up to the health department to put and use that information about what's a responsible cap on strength and potency that's reasonable. They can put that in the regs.
Have any other states done that?
Well, when we implemented the law, we didn't do it. That's a mistake that I made. The reason I didn't do it, well, there was two reasons. Number one, we only had 120 days to put all the regulations together, whereas Mississippi's going to have a whole year. And so we had to really rush to get the regulations built. But at the time, there was a big, there was a lot of talk with it in terms of the disconnect between state and federal law with respect to marijuana. And I didn't require testing because there weren't any laboratories to do the testing at the time. And I just felt like, look, we got to get this thing done in 120 days. So I never did put testing standards in place, which I regret now. But we could have, and I didn't do it. So, but I would highly recommend that Mississippi do that if it passes, that the health department put some responsible caps. And there are other, to answer your question, there's a number of other states that have now built those regulations in place. And the laboratory testing capacity builds up quickly when those things, when those caps come into play.
And I would recommend that these caps be informed by science, not fear. Right? Because there are instances where we might want high potency THC products, but used in a regulated, controlled fashion. So I think it would be misplaced to put an onerously low cap on THC. But those, I think, that would have to be determined, bringing in experts, bringing in pharmacologists who are experienced in cannabis, bringing in clinicians who are experienced with working with patients to titrate the amount of THC that might be necessary to treat certain conditions, especially the conditions that are on the qualifying condition list here in Mississippi. So I would encourage the Department of Health to bring in clinical and pharmacological experts around cannabis, because I can tell you most states do not understand what is a prudent cap on THC. It's either no cap or too much of a cap that doesn't provide for the clinical flexibility that is necessary to adequately treat patients' conditions.
And also for contaminants, because in Arizona, a much bigger topic of conversation isn't so much the fact that we don't have a cap on potency, which I didn't include in the regulations, but the fact we never required testing for contaminants like mold and that kind of stuff. And so really, in terms of the debates that are happening at the Arizona State Legislature, which is conservative, just like here in Mississippi, the debates and the bills that have been in play since we built the regulations, we're requiring the department to put standards in place for contaminants, not potency, interesting. That hasn't been what the public policy debate's been about. It's been about the quality control.
And then real quickly, the increasing THC potency is an artifact of the unregulated market, whereas more potency equals more high, which equals more valuable product. So that's where that's coming from. Yeah, no, today's weed isn't the weed of the 1970s because it's been bred and cultivated over time to the legacy market needs, right? The recreational needs. That's not the case in a medical program.
Other questions? Can you maybe dive in a little bit, like you said, some patients, depending on their condition, and it's very much a per patient situation. But for example, like a patient with cancer or some other conditions, epilepsy or ALS or MS.
Yeah,
Can you
epilepsy
kind
is
of
a
give
good
an
one.
example?
Let me do epilepsy because I
Okay.
can touch upon the Pedialex and the pediatric population. So seizures. On my slide, I demonstrated that seizures can be a combination of both endocannabinoid system excess or hyperactivity and endocannabinoid system dysfunction. And seizures have been something that has been studied with cannabis for a long time clinically. We have clinical trials including cannabis for epileptic patients of the pediatric population, no less. Epidiolex has been approved for 3 intractable seizure types. I mentioned that it's pretty much pure CBD extract. It's cut with alcohol as well as sucralose. And in our pediatric population, seizures typically come with comorbidities of autism or ADHD, some bowel issues, and alcohol and sucralose, for example, can be very disruptive to those patients. So what we're actually seeing clinically is now with Epidiolex available, patients and their parents deciding to switch from their whole plant cannabis extract to Epidiolex. And what is happening is that these patients go right back to the full plant extract because they're having unwanted side effects as a result to the potency of CBD, as well as the other ingredients in that final preparation, the alcohol and the sucralose. So we're seeing an increase in adverse behaviors and irritability and a reduction in seizure control with Pedialex, very interestingly. So a lot of folks are going right back to that full spectrum product, which contains, like I mentioned, other cannabinoids and terpenes. Linalool is a terpene found abundantly in lavender essential oil. It's very calming, but it also has anticonvulsant properties. And so do a lot of other phytochemicals. So when you're switching a patient from a full plant extract who is getting the benefit of all those phytochemicals to something that's more of an isolate, we're actually losing medicinal efficacy. And that's really unfortunate, right? In states that are sort of placing medical to the side in favor of these FDA-approved preparations that actually aren't demonstrating an improved efficacy or even safety margin as compared to the cannabis extract. And also interestingly, in our pediatric populations, when we load them with a CBD-dominant cannabis product, it's not unusual to have to eventually include increasing amounts of THC. A lot of folks are terrified of using THC in the pediatric population. But again, with medical oversight and intentional dose titration, we can get the minimal effective dose of THC, avoid the unwanted side effects of THC in that pediatric patient, and get better control of seizures. So with the plant cannabis and all of its chemical varieties, there's actually more flexibility in dialing into the unique needs of each patient. And that's really important for our epileptic kids, wherein their anti-epileptic drugs are giving them fogginess, right? We're seeing cognitive issues even in those children when they're medicated and burdened by those prescription drugs, and we're not seeing that clinically with the cannabis preparations. So we're able to decrease, again, that chemical toxicity that is a burden coming from our pharmaceutical drugs, reduce those drugs while also increasing THC. And a lot of kids don't come off those anti-epileptic drugs entirely. But again, the goal is to have some flexibility around dosing so that we can dial into the unique needs of these patients using a variety of cannabis at our disposal as opposed to relying on one isolate medicine that does not change. We just, don't have the flexibility to do so.
And also with some seizure disorders, since we're on that, I've heard, and you can speak from a medical perspective, but I've heard that sometimes if somebody's just on CBD alone, their seizures are not as well. For some patients, it works well. For other patients, having a combination of THC and CBD, a ratio there, or using, like you said, like whole plant marijuana, where it has all of the different compounds in it, those work together to help some patients better than just one thing. But it's kind of a per patient thing because there's a lot of variables, right?
There are a lot of variables. There is an ongoing study right now in Israel in pediatric epilepsy, and they encountered what I just described, right? They had started a population of children on a certain CBD to THC ratio and terpene profile. 3 months later down the line, though, a lot of these kids started seeing a return or increase in their epileptic episodes. So, like a good researcher, these researchers went back to the source and asked the cultivators and the processors, did anything change? Now they were adamant about the ratio of CBD to THC being held constant, but what actually changed was the terpene profile, right? As I mentioned, those terpenes have pharmacological value in and of themselves, many of them having an anticonvulsant property. So these children were benefiting from the entourage, we call it in cannabis medicine, of phytochemical synergy, and when you make slight changes to that chemical profile, we can see a different clinical result. So the entire plant is very important in that what you're choosing to treat one patient from another, or one type of patient to another type of patient, really does matter. And again, with a medical program with a variety of products on the marketplace, we can dial into the specific needs of a single patient or even a patient population. And that is super critically important. So I'm always speaking to the necessity of maintaining bio-variation in a marketplace, so that the clinicians who are also growing more intelligent and applying the cannabis science to the clinical setting can help patients, again, I keep saying this, dial in to the unique needs. That is something that does not exist in the conventional world with any of our pharmaceutical drugs. I mean, the best we can say is cut your pill in half or double the dose. We don't have the same flexibility in the conventional space that we have with cannabis medicine.
Other questions? So part of the purpose of having this time is medical marijuana over the next several months until November is going to be a really big topic. Voters are going to have questions, patients have questions, everybody has questions and wants to learn. And so having Dr. Knox and Will Humble here is bringing in resources who are very knowledgeable to be able to answer questions. And so a lot of you are going to be covering some of the news, and we wanted to provide an opportunity for you to better understand what a great medical marijuana program looks like, to be able to ask experts any questions that you have.
Okay. I will say one more thing. As a healthcare provider, medical cannabis has happened to us, in a sense, right? This endocannabinoid system, as I mentioned, was discovered between 1988 and 1995. It is still not being taught in medical school. I think there might be 9 programs that touch upon it in an introductory fashion, which is an improvement. But we know definitively that the endocannabinoid system is what controls all other physiological systems. So it's actually the due diligence of healthcare providers to know something about the endocannabinoid system, regardless of their bias or position on cannabis in general. If your patients are using cannabis, you need to know something about its pharmacology. You need to know something about how it works on the endocannabinoid system. And that goes to every specialist or subspecialist, because your area of expertise, whether it's the brain or the gut or the musculoskeletal system, is modulated by the endocannabinoid system. So we need to know something about it, every single one of us. And unfortunately, we have systems that censor us, but that does a disservice to our patient population who are coming in, sometimes with cannabis in their pocket already, wanting to know how to use it. We can no longer hide behind the veil of prohibition or cannabis as a Schedule I drug. If our consumers are using it, they're inevitably going to become patients who are using it. And we need to be able to have intelligent conversations with them about it so that they can trust us with sharing that information with us. Okay, it's critically important that healthcare providers get on the side of progress and learn about this physiological system, endocannabinoid system, and the pharmacology of cannabis.
Questions? Y'all are a quiet group.
I know, this is so rare.
Yeah. Connor, do you have anything that you would like to add or talk about?
I don't think I could possibly top what was just discussed. I really appreciate their perspectives. It's so important to have folks from out of the state that have lived in this world and have been a part of it in other states to be able to come here and share their perspective. We really appreciate that.
Yes, very much so. Okay, well, we are here for any questions. All right, well, thank y'all for your time and for y'all coming and being here with us this evening. One other thing I'll just mention really quickly, I don't know if some of you have heard about the alternative resolutions in our legislature that were filed last week. There have been 4, and so there were 3 filed in the House and 1 filed in the Senate. And you know, Mississippi's ballot initiative program allows voters to directly amend the state constitution. The legislature has had about 25 years to put in place a medical marijuana program, and they have failed to do so. They've not wanted to touch it. There have been multiple attempts by multiple legislators in multiple years to put a medical marijuana program in place, and none of those have ever made it to the floor for a vote at the Capitol. The one thing that we do have is Harper Grace's law that was signed into legislation in 2014, and it's now 2020, and Harper Grace has never received a drop of the medication. UMC just started a trial about a year ago that includes about 8 people. Harper Grace was not one of them. So it is not serving the state like a medical marijuana program should and like we would like it to for this wide spectrum of patients that we've talked about today. Part of the ballot initiative process is that it allows the legislature, if they disagree with the ballot initiative put onto the ballot by the voters, it allows them to put an alternative onto the ballot for the sheer purpose of killing it. So it is the campaign's position that any attempt by the legislature to put an alternative resolution onto the ballot is to kill any attempt for a medical marijuana program here in Mississippi. It requires the voters to go in on November 3rd, get to the bottom of the ballot, and for anyone who is excited about voting yes, maybe they have a loved one, they support this, whatever their reason, they get to the bottom of the ballot, and it's a 2-step convoluted process put in place in order to defeat it. So that is the campaign's stance on that. And again, there are 3 bills that were filed in the House and 1 filed in the Senate last week. Any questions on that?
Do you have those bill numbers, Sandy? Do you have the bill numbers, Sandy?
Yes. You ready? Oh yes, and after this, y'all are welcome to do one-off interviews with Dr. Knox, with Will Humble. That's totally fine. The bill numbers are in the House, it's 38, 39, and 45. And in the Senate, it's 551.
What are the flaws of each bill?
Connor?
What are the flaws of each bill? Because Angela Hill, state senator, she says she agrees with medical marijuana. She is trying to tweak y'all, what y'all are trying to do a little bit, that's all.
Sure. A couple of the House, one Senate resolution and one House concurrent resolution simply direct the legislature to adopt a medical marijuana program.
Can you speak up?
Yeah, simply require the legislature to adopt the program in 2021. That's all the bill says. It doesn't put forth any parameters on what the program would look like, provide any rights to patients or to physicians to participate in the program. So it just leaves up to the legislature to determine this next year. And so, as we heard today, our language in the ballot measure that issue 65 represents covers everything already, and it provides a lot of regulatory opportunities for the public.
What about Senator Hill's bill?
Senator Hill's bill, as I just mentioned, it just simply directs the legislature to
That's all it, that's all it does? Okay.
That would be great. If you could just send me the link so that you can
Yeah, well, I'm an attorney, but I'm a medical policy advisor.
mention them.